Welcome back to Java Space. In this video, we are going to look at design-first approach to application development. So obviously, this is a Spring Boot project. We're going to use OpenAPI and Swagger. But before we get into the practical, let's look at just basic things first. What is an API? An API stands for Application Programming Interface, and it's a way for two or more computer programs or computer applications or components to communicate with each other. So when you are designing your API, you can use two approaches. You can use code first, you can use design first. So let's look at code first versus design first. So code first, you are writing code first, then documenting the code after. So you use tools to generate documentation from the code that you have written. The design first is the opposite. You write the design, the specification first, then you write code after. And the same way, from that specification, you can generate code. And you will see why the design first approach is a bit flexible and much better approach. So what are the benefits of code first approach? Code first approach, obviously it's fast development. Why? It's fast development because developers can just start writing the code like immediately without having to spend time on documentation. And this will obviously lead to faster development cycles, especially if your project is small and you don't need to do any prototyping. Secondly, easier iterations. Since code is the starting point, it's easy to iterate and make changes to the implementation. And developers can quickly modify the code and generate the API documentation, making it more flexible and adaptable to changing requirements. Direct control over implementation. So developers have full control over the implementation details when the code first approach is used. And why is this important for you to have full control? You can fine tune the code, performance, you can optimize the performance, you can handle specific edge, cases, you integrate it seamlessly with existing system. So that means you have full control. Nothing can actually limit you in terms of what you want. But with API design first, you will see that in a way you are constrained. All right, seamless integration with existing code base. So if you are building an API on top of an existing code base, the code first approach allows for more seamless integration. Developers can leverage the existing code base and build the API on top of it, reducing duplication and improving maintainability. Of course, there are drawbacks of code first. The obvious one is lack of documentation. When you do not have documentation in place, it becomes difficult, for developers to understand how to use the API because there is no documentation. The only way for them to understand how to use the API, they have to physically look at, the code base itself, and also increase dependency on code base. So with the code first approach, the API documentation is tightly coupled with the code base. Any changes made to the code may require corresponding changes to the documentation, and this obviously will lead to maintenance overhead, especially when multiple developers are working on the project. Then we have limited design flexibility. By starting with code first, there's a risk of limiting the design flexibility of the API. Without a clear design upfront, developers may end up with an API that is tightly coupled, hard to extend, difficult to maintain in the long run. As I said before, it's more difficult, for consumers of your API, testers or writers, to talk about your API or to understand it because at the start there is no documentation. They have to go and look at the code for them to understand, your API. Then we have design first approach. What are the benefits? We have improved API usability. So developers can focus on creating a clean and intuitive interface for the API. This approach allows for a better understanding of the API's purpose, making it easier for developers to use and integrate into their applications. Secondly, reduced development time. Designing the API first helps identify potential issues and challenges early in development process. This allows developers to address these issues before even writing the code, therefore saving time, effort in the long run. Better collaboration. This is probably the best. API first approach encourages, collaboration between different teams such as developers, designers, stakeholders. By visualizing the API clearly everyone involved can provide feedback and suggestions, leading to a more refined and well-rounded API. Improved documentation. Designing the API first allows for creation of comprehensive and accurate documentation. This is why, Spring is one of the leading projects today. When Spring was designed, they actually started with the documentation. So this now tells why the documentation is important when it comes to coding. So this documentation can serve as a reference for developers using the API, providing clear instructions and examples on how to interact with the API. The last one is easier testing and debugging. With the API design in place, developers can start testing, debugging the API even before the actual code is written. This allows for early detection and resolution of any issues, resulting in a more stable and reliable API. Right? We still have more limited. These are the drawbacks. So one other thing that I like about design first approach is that front-end developers, or not even the consumers of your API can continue development as though the API already exists. Why? Because they know the contract, they know the inputs and the output of the API. So they can code to that. While the back-end developers, the people that are working on the API itself, they are busy developing the API. So we see that development can happen in parallel, which is what the last point is saying, that even before they can start doing that, even before the actual code is written. Of course, the design first approach has its own drawbacks. The first one being limited flexibility. Designing the API first may limit the flexibility to make changes during the development process. Once the design is finalized, making significant changes to the API structure or functionality can be time-consuming and may require substantial rework. Potential misalignment with implementation. There is a risk of the API design not aligning perfectly with the implementation. This can lead to inconsistencies and discrepancies between the expected behavior and the actual behavior of the API. The learning curve. Adopting the API design-first approach may require a learning curve for developers who are not familiar with this methodology. It may take some time for developers to understand the design tools, processes involved in designing the API first. Lastly, dependency on design tools. So designing the API first often requires the use of specialized design tools. This dependency on specific tools may limit the accessibility and availability of the design process. for all team members. All right, now that we have looked at these two design approaches, these two approaches we can use when we are doing application development. The question that we can ask ourselves now is, choosing the right approach will depend on, many factors. The first one in the list, project complexity. If the project is relatively simple and straightforward, the code-first approach may be more suitable. You can quickly iterate, make changes as needed without the need for detailed API documentation. Team size. If you have a large team with multiple stakeholders, the API design first approach can help ensure everyone is on the same page and avoid miscommunication. It provides a clear blueprint for the development process and facilitates collaboration. Collaboration level. If your project requires close collaboration between different teams, the API design first approach can help foster communication and alignment. It allows for early feedback and input from various stakeholders, resulting in a more robust and well-designed API. The audience. Design first approach is best when your API's target audience is external customers or partners. The API contract or OpenAPI specification document can be visualized with tools like Swagger Editor, which depicts the input and outputs in a more human readable manner. Like if someone is telling you that they have built a very nice system, the first thing you will ask, what is your API? I want to look at your API. Then we know as developers that when we look at the API specification, we are then in a good position to understand how the system works.